Hello, everyone. Welcome on this March 27th, 2023. My name is Aurelio Muraca. I will be moderating this last presentation of Earth in Crisis with Professor Mitch Wagener, Western Connecticut State University's biology department on this very sort of different, we're going to kind of not making more of a presentation, but we're going to kind of hope that we get up a dialogue this session, and we would ask you for your participation. So at that point, we will engage all of you in a discussion on where do we go from here and what future would you like? And once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Mitch Wagener for presenting this another engaging series. And we will be doing this again in the fall. We've been just discussing some topics, and I think you're really going to like the next series. So without further ado, Mitch, you have the comm, sir.
Okay, let's see. All right. So, all right. Come on. There we go. Hopefully, can you see the Jetsons?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna show my age here. By the way, I'm 64. I may have been a college professor for 26 years, 27 years, something like that at Western. And we have 2 daughters grown up and a grandson. And much of my motivation, if I haven't said it in the past, is making the world a better place for him. He's a little old guy. He's 5 years old, and he just he needs someone to stand in his corner, besides his parents, of course. And so his grandma and I do that. There were times you hear my dog. 30 seconds. Ringo.
Yes, his dog is named Ringo.
All right, so I'm back. I have this dog who's a little bit of a lunatic, but you be a nice boy now. Okay. If I have to put him back in jail, I will. When I was a kid, and maybe this is the same as some of you, the future that I imagined was the future that I saw in the Jetsons. Okay. Classic cartoon. That included George and his happy family and flying cars and telecommuting, where he's looking at his crazy boss over the screen, and his kid would go to Elroy would go to the doctor remotely, and a lot of things which seemed outlandish back in the day is less outlandish now. Not flying cars, of course, but maybe we'll get to that point, but we're not there yet. But it took me a while until I realized that the Jetsons were really just a different styled version of the Flintstones, made by the same people, I think. And which was happy families living in a mythical Stone Age, with all sorts of crazy stuff going on. And then it wasn't until later I realized that the Flintstones were just really a cartoon version of the Honeymooners. And which were was a sitcom, Jackie Gleason and Art Carney back in the 50s, which they continued on with during the Jackie Gleason show as a skit. Well, the future is kind of is a undiscovered country, so we don't really know exactly what to think of it yet, because we haven't experienced it, and we have to, if we want to have some say as to how it turns out, I think that we need to do some thinking about it and discussion among ourselves as to what is the appropriate, the things that we want and how we want to get them. As I mentioned earlier, while we were kind of waiting for people to sign on, it's a conversation I have with my students all the time. Okay, Ringo, you're being a pill. One more brief interlude. Ringo, be nice. He's a terrier, can't help himself. All right. So it's a conversation I have with my students all the time because they feel they know the world is changing. They know that they're going to inherit something that is not their creation. Therefore, they're nervous about it. And quite nervous. Some of them are quite nervous about it. They discuss this among themselves, and I do my best to pull it, to give them a chance to vent and to discuss it with me as well. Well, the future really started, I think, the future that we are dealing with now started back around 1800 when we discovered the wonderful effects of fossil fuels. We could use coal to boil water and the water to run engines and do all sorts of stuff. And some of it which was quite beneficial to us, some of which wasn't. And some of the stuff that wasn't beneficial didn't become apparent until later, but it's abundantly clear now. And that industrial revolution, of course, morphed into the part of it that I'm the most familiar with as a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s. I never lived in Los Angeles or someplace where you had traffic jams quite this bad, although I've been in some traffic jams, and you don't have to breathe too much car exhaust in to realize that, you know what, all these cars are a problem. And one of the effects of the future, which was coming about then, was not only that we could get places point A to point B quickly, but sometimes we could get there very slowly. And it wasn't necessarily a very pleasant trip. And of course, the ability to drive your own personal chariot without horses from point A to point B was made possible by the invention in the internal combustion engine, which had to run on petroleum. Coal and petroleum are the two main fossil fuels along with natural gas, and they are not, well, let's put it this way. Coal is fossilized swamp plants. Much of it 300 million years old and took a while to fossilize and everything. Petroleum is a different thing. It's fossilized ocean plankton, okay? Again, that dies and sinks to the bottom, gets mixed in with the mud and gets fossilized over years and years. And both types of fossil fuels will produce methane gas with mixtures of other things in it as a byproduct, natural gas. And so we have these materials that were alive hundreds of millions of years ago that have been out of the carbon cycle for hundreds of millions of years. Okay, there's a natural carbon cycle where I exhale CO2, that CO2 is in the atmosphere. At some point, it will be pulled in by a plant somewhere who will then turn it into a carbohydrate. The carbohydrate at the plant is eaten by an animal, which then releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. That's an overly simplified version of the carbon cycle, because some of that CO2 stays in the atmosphere a good while. Some of it is absorbed into the oceans and becomes bicarbonate and then can acidify the oceans, which is a problem. And some of it, is released as aerosols, which are particulates and tiny bits of liquid that are suspended in the atmosphere and so on. And the stuff just is bopping around. The key thing is that this material that has caused our temperatures of the air to go up considerably are materials that for the previous 300 million years were out of the loop and underground. And so they just weren't doing us any harm. They were just down there, right? They were buried and so on. And so by burning this stuff, we're adding to the total amount of carbon in the carbon cycle. Now, the carbon cycle has become, had more carbon in it and less carbon in it over Earth's history, but the changes have always occurred at a very slow pace over tens of thousands of years, okay? It took thousands of years for the last ice age to melt, to stop, and for that ice to melt, okay? The changes we're seeing now, because we are driving them so hard with the waste products of our civilization, are happening. Well, the Industrial Revolution was a mere 200,000 years ago, so it hasn't been very long, and we're doing it fast. We're doing the fast, and we don't know exactly how to stop it. It's like a car that's over your bike going down the hill, and you realize you don't have brakes, and your bike's going really fast, and you're trying to figure out, well, how is the least possible way to stop this bike before I run into the river or whatever. And you try to think about all sorts of things, and you may stop it, or maybe you don't, and maybe you feel the pain at the end. But that's the position we're in. We're riding downhill on a big bike, and we're trying to think about how to stop it. And what's more, there are a lot of other people on the back of the bike who want it just to continue on going down fast as fast as can be, because they're having a good thrill out of it. And so it's a hard ride to stop. It's an addiction. Well, these things, which of course are oil pumps always, or oil wells always, remind me of this thing. If you remember these from cafes around the world, the dipping bird or the drinking bird or so on. Okay, so that reminds me of this. Anyway, so by taking all this previously living material and burning it, as we have, and we're all part of that problem, we are in fact doing something that we can observe and measure. There's a fellow named Keeling who worked at a lab up on Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And back in the late 50s, he invented a gizmo for measuring accurately the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Before that, we had other ways to do it, but it wasn't something that you could just sort of set up the machine and run. And automatic data collection and all that sort of stuff. It was a more cumbersome process for measuring CO2. It's probably something based on an infrared gas analyzer or something. I'm not sure exactly what contraption he used, but it's still working. And we have seen the amount of CO2 go up, and we see two things here going up, two things happening. One of them is the zigzag. The zigzag is because that's the seasons we're seeing there, because there are more trees doing more photosynthesis in the northern hemisphere. So during the northern summer, oh, there he is, looking for my dog. During the northern summer, there are more trees pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, and the amount of CO2 goes down for a while. Then in the northern winter, the southern summer, the same thing happens only on the southern hemisphere, but there isn't as much land mass, and there aren't as much trees. So the amount of CO2 pulled out in December is different than the amount pulled out in June. And so we see this little zigzag, which is very consistent. The other thing is we see that year after year after year, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. We also see it, if you squint just right, that this is not a linear trend. It's accelerating, or it seems to be. Now, the Mauna Loa just recently erupted in the last year. And so the data collection gizmos had to be moved over to Mauna Kea, which is the mountain next door, to continue on. And so this includes the Mauna Kea data in little blue dots there. All right, so that's CO2. CO2 is a important greenhouse gas. It's produced by life. It's produced by volcanoes and so on. The other one that is second in importance, well, in some ways it is methane. Methane is the main component of natural gas. And so some of the methane that we see increasing in the atmosphere in a not quite a straight line is is coming from leaky gas pipes and leaky wells that are not closed up properly after the company has pulled the petroleum out of it. They've just let it loose to let it spew methane. And methane is molecule for molecule 17,000 or 17 times as much heat absorption per molecule as CO2. So it's a big thing. Methane also can come from the digestion of some animals like cows and sheep and deer and goats and horses to a smaller amount, even some humans. And so that's a source of methane. And methane also is released by bacteria living in swamps and rice paddies. Okay, and there's some other sources of methane as well. Methane is an important greenhouse gas. Okay, and also the strongest greenhouse gases are ones that were made industrially that do not exist outside of us dumping them into the atmosphere. And those are the chlorofluorocarbons and the hydrofluorocarbons like Freon. Okay. Put it all together, and there's also nitrous oxide. And water vapor is actually a greenhouse gas as well. It's just a very weak one, molecule for molecule, but there's a lot of it. So it still has a role. And put it all together, and we see a temperature trend like this. And this is, each red dot is an average temperature for a year. The farther we go back in time, the harder it is to estimate, because we didn't have satellites back then. And we have to figure the temperature based on a variety of very different measurements, some of which are thermometer readings, and some of them are observations of other sorts. But we can see the trend. We see that the temperature doesn't go up year after year after year, but goes up and then comes down a little bit, and then goes up and comes down a little bit, and so on. And that's due to things like El Nino, La Nina, and volcanoes and things like that. The trend is pretty clear. And heat coming into the atmosphere is not the only thing. It's other things that are going on. For instance, humidity. As you put more heat in the atmosphere, more water evaporates. Okay, so your humidity goes up. Okay, and humidity is water vapor, which is a greenhouse gas, a weak one. If and when I ever see people anymore that are a little bit skeptical of climate change or don't think it's really bad, I usually say, well, look at the ice. The ice in the world, in terms of glaciers and ice sheets, is melting year after year. And it is actually speeding up. And the ice that's near the water is melting from contact with the ocean, and it's also melting from contact to the air. And it can weaken to the point where it can just kind of let go. You know, that's what you have. That's what calving is. If you see glaciers calve. And the changes in temperature are not only in melting the ice, which is going to increase sea level. Okay, warming the water and melting the ice is the two things that will raise sea level. but it also, the temperatures are changing the seasons. The animals and plants are kind of confused. And if you have a plant that blooms at a certain time, with the understanding, the evolutionary understanding that there'll be an insect there to pollinate it, and suddenly it blooms at a different time, and the insect isn't there yet because they're on a different schedule following different cues, then you have a mismatch in their life cycles, and you have a plant unable to pollinate, to be pollinated and reproduce, and you have an insect that's not getting enough food. Okay, bad for both. Okay, so these sorts of things will affect. Plus, as the world warms, insects will, in some insects may be able to reproduce more times during a year than they did before, which is good if it's an insect that benefits us, like pollinators. It's bad if it's an insect that is either a disease carrier or something that eats the plants we like to eat ourselves. And so there are a lot of things going on, and we don't really know. We know what's happening. We know it's bad. We don't know how far it's going to go. Okay. And here's the thing, even though it's happening fast from a geological sense, it's happening slow relative to the lives and observations of a single human. And so we, unless you look at the data or have the scientists tell you about it, you may not perceive it all. Then some of it, you damn well perceive it because the tornado blew through your little small town in Mississippi and flattened everything. Or some other disastrous thing comes along and hammers us. I recently wrote a brief report for the interim president of WestCon. There's a temporary president there while they sort a few things out, and then while they hire a new person. And I wrote him a little report explaining how I expected climate change to affect campus and students, and what he should know about as the leader, even if it's a short time, of Western. Okay, it's called On a Warming Campus. That's what I named it. That's the title. I'd be glad to share that with anybody if you like. Just have to let me know, and I can share it with you. And it's only a couple of pages long. All right, so the world we know that we inherit is going to be even more changed when it comes time for my grandson, who's 5 years old now, to have his own kids. Okay, if he does. All right, it's a what we see as the world as it is now is odd and hot enough. The world that he grows up in is going to be something else again. Okay, and if he has children, my great-grandchildren, who I may or may not ever meet, are going to have a world which is even more different, even more dangerous to them. All right, and so that's the world. That's where we are. And another thing to realize is that the scientists are telling us that we need to do what we can to limit the temperature increase of the atmosphere to 1.5 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution, since 1800 or so. Okay. And there will be damage done to the ecosystems, the biosphere, from that. But it is more manageable than if we left it go to 2. If we let it go to 2, it's, at 1.5, the major ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica will likely stay intact, but at 2, they will likely collapse. And if they do, we're talking rapid sea level rise. And we're talking about tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people who are refugees at that point, including some of them who may be our neighbors. Okay. At 1.5 degrees, 70% of coral reefs may be lost. Bad enough, that's awful. But at 2 degrees, it'll be almost all of them. Just to set how serious this is as serious as a heart attack. Someone polled the scientists to actually study this and make these projections and said, okay, how high do you think it's going to go? And the average was 3 degrees Celsius. And so we're facing some pretty rough times, but we can deal with it. We know how to deal with it. The reason we aren't dealing with it is the subject of what we're going to discuss tonight. Okay. And what we've got to do to change that. There's been 1.2 degrees Celsius since 1900, just so you know where we are right now. Okay, so that leads us to this question. What I have a series of questions, and these are questions similar to the ones that I ask my students, but they're just as relevant to you all who are perhaps of an age to be my students' children, or children, parents or grandparents even, okay? And not making any assumptions about who's in the audience. And these are questions that we need to think about. Because if we're just riding the tiger and we don't know where the tiger is going to take us or when the tiger is going to throw us off and eat us, are we being very responsible? I think every day about what my responsibility is to my grandson. And my standard line, if you've seen any of these talks, you heard me say it, what's best for my grandson is what's best for me. Okay. And it's all a matter of the golden rule. Treating people the way you want to be treated. And that has to apply in a global civilization, that has to apply for people who live in countries we've never visited and people who we've never met. Because we're, as Carl Sagan says, we're all in the same greenhouse. So what kind of future do you want?
Folks, you can unmute yourselves. You can put the camera on if you'd like.
Please do.
This is the part where we're going to be discussing some things what Dr. Wagener is talking about. So if you're so inclined to, you can do so. You can unmute yourself. You can put yourself on camera, or if not, you can type into the chat if you're feeling shy, and that's okay. So it's up to us to actually talk about this, towards the end of the series, and maybe get some ideas and, have a little bit of a dialogue with one another. So we do have something in the chat right now. Individuals, families can recycle, eat less meat, provide for pollinators in our yard, etc., but seems kind of hopeless, to be honest. Do you agree that corporations, governments need to be more heavily involved for change to occur? That seems so hopeless. So what can we do?
I absolutely agree that has to happen. I'm an ecologist. That's my academic field, and it's a matter of and one of the things that we deal with is something called ecological scale. The scale of an ant operates is different than a scale in which an entire ecosystem operates. Okay, they do different things. They are controlled by different processes, and absolutely, it is necessary that we do the little stuff. That is all necessary, but it's not sufficient. Okay, kind of a trite saying that is very appropriate for this discussion. Necessary, but not sufficient. We have to not only do our part, but we have to insist that our governments and corporations do their part, because they have the strength of numbers, they have resources that individuals do not have. But we have control over them to some degree, because every vote is a signal and every dollar we spend is a signal. I once asked, and this is related, I once asked Jane Goodall, the famous chimp behavioral biologist who has a long-term relationship with Western, going back 20 some years. I've met her 4 or 5 times. It's been quite a privilege. Anyway, I asked Jane what was the best thing individuals could do to reduce their emissions, and her answer was this, very simple, was be aware of how you live and what you do and what you eat and all these things. And that is probably excellent advice for us as individuals. But then we have to act in larger groups as well.
I've told that to my
Oh.
kids.
Tell that to your kids?
Yeah, I told that to my kids. So that is, I said that's very sage advice from Dr. Jane Goodall. Let's get one more question in, and then I see.
Oh,
there's
I think
someone
Donna
up.
down here has her hand up.
Yeah. So.
Is that me? Hello? Am I on?
Yeah, go ahead.
No.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I agree with the previous comment, and I do think it starts at a grassroots level. Our Connecticut ought to be a leader in recycling, our reduce, reuse, recycle. We are actually shipping things out to Pennsylvania. Plastics are one of the worst pollutants of our planet now. Plastics have become like fire and water. They could be your best friend or your worst enemy. Single-use plastics are, I think, in the EU going to be banned in 2 years. We are not a leader. We do need to do everything possible at home, but most people won't. And I think it's going to have to become more rigid, or they're going to have to enhance the people's interest by making it a monetary reward system. I don't know, but I find it very depressing that, I mean, even today, I just went to Costco to fill up my gas, and people had thrown plastic bottles in the trash. That upsets me. Every day I wake up and think about how we're destroying our planet, and you'll hear people say, remember 20 years ago when you used to drive on the highway and you had insects all over your windshields? Oh no, those insects have been destroyed by pesticides now. So we have so much work to do. It does seem insurmountable. And well, I hope the Union of Concerned Scientists is helping, but it's a grassroots effort.
Yeah, we all have to do it. It's not limited to any one person. We all have to do what we can do. I find out something that you can do and that you're passionate about, and do it. Push on it. Find out about it, and then learn all the details, and then explain it to other people.
Would you have a question on the chat?
There's
What
a
can
hand
we
up
do?
too.
Yeah, she's on the phone, I think, right now, but let's go to Heather's question. What can we do with the world's greatest producers of carbon emitters, like India and China, etc.?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing in that our country and other countries in the industrial West have burnt through tons of carbon, and to get to the economic system and the level of life that we enjoy now. And then here comes countries that are behind us in that regard, and they claim the ability to do the same thing. And after all, we did it, and we didn't even seem to think twice about it at the time. And then we say that they can't. And so it's a hard thing. The best thing we can do on the long run is do what we can do, and that is to clean up our own act first. And so that we'll be a better example to the rest of the world. I don't know a better answer than that. I wish I did.
Francine, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
It's not a question. Well, it's a question, but a comment. I do agree with you that we have to be individuals and do things. I remember in the 70s, I stopped using hairspray unless, and eventually the hairspray went without some of the aerosol ingredients and they changed it. So while it's fair, my idea is fairly unpopular, I do think that we have to have governmental bodies and environmental bodies and OSHA and so on that will protect us and force, either by taxation or by legalization or illegalization, force manufacturers to have better manufacturing processes and produce better products. And right now, a concern of mine is the microplastics in aerosols, and that we're inhaling it, and they predict lung diseases and other diseases and so on. It's a huge problem, but individuals, I mean, I have been recycling since the 70s and say being aware of using aerosols and that sort of thing. But most people aren't. If you look at the supermarket shelves, they're still manufacturing things. And I do think we need to have international regulation. It's not just the United States. It has to be. And I understand the third world countries say, look, you can afford to do it. You have made your money. You have a good standard of living. Look how well everybody. And well, we're not doing so well in health anymore and maternity, but we have higher standards than they do, and they say we just want to get there. So I can understand that, but it has to be that we are one ecosystem, one Earth, and we have to be able to work together in order to achieve a healthy life for all of us. And I don't see it done. I don't see it done without international standards.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. One of the things that is unfair about the world, of which there are many, one of the things is that those people who are the most responsible, large groups that are most responsible for getting us in the situation we are in, are the ones that will feel the pain the least. And those like poor people in Bangladesh and right. Swamps around Calcutta and things like that, who did not contribute very much to this, are the ones that are going to suffer first. And it's totally unfair. It's a complex world we live in, but I agree with you.
Well, what we have to do, I think, is NGOs and government bodies bring in the infrastructure that those poor people in poor places, they're poor in money, and I'm feeling sorry for them, so they use the word both ways. But that we help bring in infrastructure. And that's what's so frightening about China bringing in infrastructure too, because they are extending their influence to African nations and Mexico and other areas, let alone the Asia. And so it's a very complex problem. But I'm a great believer that that eventually we will sort it out, and we'll do it. But some people will have a lot of pain as we do it.
Yeah. I mean, China is also in the odd position that the city in the world that is the most endangered of sea level rise is Shanghai.
Right.
And partly because it's right at sea level, but partly because there's a lot of people in Shanghai. And it won't take much of a sea level rise until they're going to have a massive refugee problem on their hands. And not only them, it's going to affect sea levels, just not in one place. It's going to be all over the place. I used to live in Thailand as a kid, and Bangkok is, going to be, it's right at sea level right now.
Well, we see the damage sea level has done even in normal, well, I can't say they're normal times. There may have been
whatever normal was.
In Venice, for example. where
Yeah.
they have tried methods of a seawall, and there are different things about trying things in New York City and things that are done in the Netherlands. And I mean, it's such a multifaceted problem,
It sure
which
is.
makes it that to me, it's interesting that people only look at one aspect, and that you really can't look at just how much carbon is being deposited by the cows here, or how much we're eating. We have to look at lots of different things by lots of different people who understand situations and listen to them, and not say, oh, it's never going to happen here, because it does happen here. It doesn't matter if it's the Mississippi River, or if it's Long Island, or it is Florida, or Texas, or California. We have climate change that has affected almost every area of our country, let alone the world. And I think we have to have a bit. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, I lived in Alaska for 13 years. I went to grad school up there, and that's the place that's really being hammered by climate change.
And so why don't we dig another well in the Alaskan waters?
Yeah, that's a hard one to explain. And I don't.
Especially since he campaigned against it.
Yeah, no, I've heard the explanation, and it's very convoluted. He may be right. I mean, it may be a fact that losing a court case would be more harmful in the long run than just giving in. But man, it galls.
Yeah, there is. Mhm. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Oh, you're
Interesting. Interesting.
welcome.
We have another question from Kathleen. Also, can you please provide the link for the article you wrote to the interim
Oh, sure.
president of WCSU?
What I'll do, I mean, it's not on a link right now. I can make it one. I'll make sure that Aurelio has a copy. And can you be the point person then?
Certainly, I will send that to everyone along with a link to this discussion for this evening.
Or let me just give you my email, my university email. I'm just going to type it in the chat if the dog lets me. Nope. Pesky little terrier. Hang on there. Spell this right. Yeah.
Of course, if anyone else has any questions or concerns regarding this topic this evening, please feel free to do so.
There's my university email up at WestCon, and if you would like a copy of that white paper, whatever the hell it was I wrote, ask me for it. I'll be glad to send it to you. Do we have more comments on this question, or should I move to the next one?
I believe we can move on.
All right, let's see here. Let's see. Who benefits from the status quo? There is pushback. There is slow walking. One thing I've noticed is that I'm not encountering that many people who are saying, hell no, there is no climate change. That's all a big lie. I'm sure there's people still around, but I'm not seeing them in Connecticut anymore. What I'm hearing is people who are saying, yeah, I realize that climate change is real, but I'm not sure it's really that much of a big deal. Or we're always going to need fossil fuels. So what do we do? And they're slow walking it. They're trying their best to slow the response to fixing it. And if you talk to these folks, generally you find out that they are retired fossil fuel employees. And I suspect that no one wants to think that their life's work has destroyed something for the rest of us. Most people don't want to think that. And B, perhaps they've got stock options and they are hoping the stock price stays high long enough for them to live out the rest of their lives. So who benefits from the status quo? Robert Kennedy said, change has its enemies. I mean, I think obviously it's the people who are selling the stuff that cause the problem, who are a great part of the people who benefit in the status quo.
Lobbyists and politicians.
Yeah, and people who have stock in the fossil fuel companies. One of the things that they know, that the fossil fuel people know quite well, that the general public doesn't, is if you take all of the fossil fuels that are on the books of the coal and oil and gas companies, those which they have the legal right to mine and sell, if you added them all up across the world, you would have this large amount of fossil fuels that are there. They are spoken for. They are in the pipeline, quote unquote, to burn. But in order to keep the temperature below 2 degrees and rise, which would be too hot anyway, we can only burn about 20% of what is on the books. And so 80% of the fossil fuel that is owned by companies and petrostates like Russia, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia has to remain a stranded asset. I think that's probably where a lot of the resistance is coming from nations and corporations. And the slow walking too. Let's just sell a little bit more of our goods and make a little bit more money before the faucet has to be turned off. The one of the first economists who actually said all that in public was a fellow named Mark Carney, who was the governor of the main bank in Britain, whatever that is called, I forgot. And before he retired, he stood up and says, okay, 80% of the fossil fuels has to stay in the ground. And people just freaked. As well they should.
Are we at that point where, it's harder and harder to get fossil fuels?
To get it out?
Yeah.
I think
it's like running out that whole peak oil.
Oh yeah. It's my understanding is it's less economic to pull it out of the ground because renewables are so much cheaper than they used to be.
Yeah.
And so if you would take all the subsidies off all of it, take all the subsidies off all the government subsidies and targeted tax cuts and all that stuff off all the fossil fuels, off all the renewable energy, and just let the market decide, it would work out.
Yeah, I agree.
But the fossil fuel companies, I don't think, want it to work out that way because they've been used to being, treated special.
Oh my God, that would be capitalism.
Yeah, yeah. Can you imagine that? The market decides
Jeez.
you just take all the government intervention off of it and let it go. At this point, anyway, there's other reasons to have controls on such things, but all right. So here's another cosmic question. Why does the short-term benefit always seem to take precedent over the long-term benefit? Why is the value of our lives, us older folks' lives, seem to be more important to the world than the value of the future lives of our grandchildren and present lives of our grandchildren? Think about all the things that government does that favors those people who can vote, as opposed to the little guys who can't vote yet, I guess. I don't know.
Well, we have a comment, selfishness and greed.
Yeah.
And I can attest to that because right now, there's things that I'm doing in my my own personal life with updating and renovating my own home, and also my parents' business, and trying to think long term. And there's one of my parents is dead set against any sort of change, any sort of improvement, any sort of streamlining for the future. They don't want to spend a nickel on anything. If they have too much trash, they take the trash from the trash bin and they put it into the recycling bin, and they put it out to the street. and that is something that I see that it's affecting my kids, and saying, what are you doing? And I'm like to them, well, grandma, grandpa, I'm not going to tell which one, is not concerned with that. Even though they're well into their late 70s, they are still thinking it's me and my business, and my business is basically short term. I'm not going to think about your lives. You guys deal with that. But for now, I'm just going to try to save every little nickel. And at the same time, like, you have plenty of money to live out the rest of your days in comfort. And you still think like that. And that's something that I'm also trying to change in my own life with my own kids, that we're trying to think long term in terms of like how our actions affect not only ourselves, our community, and also the planet in general. And it's hard, but I'm telling you right now, is like, as long as we make a break from that and do that sort of systematic sort of change within the next generation, because that is a huge deal. That is like almost like number one or number two on a lot of these young kids' minds, is like, what kind of future are we being left by our parents and grandparents and so forth. And it's very,
Well,
very
that's good to hear.
I'm sorry.
I'm glad the youth is thinking that way. But I think part of it is the unpredictability and uncertainty of the future. Like they say, the best laid plans often go astray. I mean, we absolutely can do a lot, but a lot of people are cynical because they've seen, things happen like these bank failures and inflation. But you have to look at the big picture, and I think that comes also, like the other listener said, from our leaders, and there has to be some stimulation with the corporations and the government and politicians to get us on the right path.
Yeah. Well, I'm an educator, so what I do my best to do is educate not only my college students, but general public. That's why I'm here and do what I do. And another thing that I tell students, if someone or anybody, if someone has a desire to help, think about what is what you're most passionate about in relation to the things we've been talking about. Learn as much as you can about that thing. Find out how to explain that thing and your passion to other people, and push on it.
I agree. It's something that there's so much uncertainty, as what you were saying about the future. But as we move on, things will become clearer. But at the same time, we also have to educate ourselves and get the message clear, and not be sort of dissuaded by any sort of like misinformation or disinformation, because it's going to be out there as we see now. But it's to make sure that we have an educated populace, an educated community, educated children, and neighbors that can make these little decisions that will have like a long-term impact.
But we've gone backwards in Connecticut in recycling. I mean,
Yeah.
You can't even recycle. It's being sent out to a different state. I mean, there has to be some economic stimulants to get to either stop making these plastics or have a good use for them. Stimulate corporations to do something with them, to build houses with them, or I don't know what, or just stop making them. It's just destroying the oceans, the air, and like the other listener said about we all are supposed to be tested positive now for having pieces of plastic in our blood system. Oh, wonderful. Well, I think that's going to cause cancer. Oh, it's pretty tough. I mean, we've allowed the corporations to just run the country.
Yep. Yep. Well, we can all do what we can do. Okay. And it's emotionally a difficult thing to deal with, but we
It is.
do what we can do, and I try to educate our students so that so that they are better prepared to make good decisions. One thing I'll say for my university is we are becoming much more, the faculty are teaching more courses on this topic than once was the case. In fact, we might be kind of ahead of the rest of the state at the moment. And we're trying. Our faculty is really trying.
Well, we have to get our local politicians and then up to Washington to enforce this, and like the other listener said, make it global, because I mean, we can't even recycle. Where do we recycle textiles? Where do we recycle number 5s? It's just sad.
Sometimes we get our priorities wrong too, and we get all bent out of shape about TikTok when the TikTok is what's behind us. Before we run out, I think it's funny. Before we run out of time, and I think we're almost there, there's Kurt Vonnegut. We could have saved the earth, but we were too damn cheap.
Yeah, he had it right.
Thank you. At Western, for the next 4 weeks, we've already had one of these. We have a set of public talks for the general public.
Oh,
in the science building.
Thank you.
This is, like I say, Dr. Wong has already done his on toxic cyanobacteria. This on Wednesday, Dr. Brian Stankus in the chemistry department, plus a student. Most of these are a professor teaming up with a student to deliver a talk to the public on his field in chemistry. And then Hannah Reynolds, our microbiologist, is talking about fungal diseases and climate. And then Manoj Misra is from Bangladesh himself. He's a sociologist, is going to be talking about environmental justice at home and abroad. And then I'll be finishing it up with a talk on hope. And this is free.
Wonderful.
The Science Building, 125, starting at 7 p.m. In the next 4 Wednesdays.
Oh,
So,
that's great. And then
bring your
and we
kids.
got Earthgate coming up.
And we got Earth Day coming up. I'll be speaking at the
22nd.
I'll be speaking at the new Fairfield Earth Day this year.
I just want to
Wonderful.
comment that getting rid of trash is an ancient story,
Yeah.
and archaeologists love it. And that they were able to piece together how people lived, whether it's 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, whatever. And what will our story be? A little different. It's also a question. We have, one of the problems is that we have concentrated population, and because we have concentrated population, we have concentrated trash, and we haven't made accommodations or figured out how to get rid of trash other than putting it in the soil or putting it in the earth and then capping it and then having methane problems and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's a multifaceted problem. No problem can be looked at it totally by itself.
We should be able to deal with that plastic by converting into something useful.
There's
Exactly.
lots of things.
Exactly.
In other times, people, you mentioned cloth, people would take that cloth and make it into a quilt,
Right.
or make it into clothing, or recycle it in many, many ways, and we just trash. And that's one of the issues I have with people who buy cheap stuff. Because people who buy cheap stuff, maybe design oriented, or being have to be in the most fashionable items or whatever, they're not looking for quality things that are going to last for a long time. So whether it's furnishing your house with a sofa that is going to stand up for 20 years, and God forbid you not to change your mind, because I have family members who change their minds and they get rid of perfectly good stuff. And I don't quite understand that, but you buy a quality item and you can have it for a long time, and you don't have to worry about getting rid of cheap stuff, or getting rid of your clothes every year, and replacing it and that sort of thing. So again, it's a feeling of gratification, immediate gratification, immediate, that you have to keep, other than grade and whatever that you mentioned, that someone mentioned before. But there are a lot of psychological reasons that people do these things, or they just don't realize that they could buy a skirt or a pair of slacks or something that could last a number of years, and they don't have to replace it and toss it. And then you don't have the problem of where is it going to go?
There's a certain
Oh, well, even sheets and towels and stuff like that,
there's a certain
Anyway.
ethic we need to build up. It's an ethic that some of the Native American groups had, of called the 7-generation principle, that we make decisions based on what's best for the 7 generations to come.
Hmm.
And it's just an extension of the golden rule. If we really think about, okay, do I need this thing? What is it going to do to the other people on the planet that have to share this area with me? I mean, do I need it? I have to ask myself this stuff all the time, because we're all tempted in similar ways. And
Oh, yeah, in this
it's an
country.
it's an ethical thing. We have to think that we need to live in a humane fashion in treating our fellow humans right. And to do that, maybe we don't need all that plastic junk.
No,
I'm talking to
our
myself.
economy is driven by consumerism.
Yeah. So
Bad.
sometimes you have to ignore the consumerism. Easier said than done, I know.
Yep. Go to Habitat for no, what is it? The resale store and Goodwill and Savers.
Yeah, well, that's what my wife does. She's big on Savers.
Same here.
It's good.
I just wear things until they wear out. My standard. So I look ratty at some point, but I feel good about myself.
If you keep things long
You're
enough,
saving
back
the
in style.
planet.
Yeah, I may look like a hobo, but it's for a good cause.
Well, thank you, everyone. We are speaking to the choir, but that's all.
Yeah, we need
do have
to
one-
bolster our confidence sometimes.
We do have one comment from Donna, and I think then we'll just leave it at that, and we'll call it an evening. Thank you. Sometimes people don't change until they feel enough pain. Slow walk is right. When I see people take advantage of whatever they can while they wait for the bad news, I know places that have given up recycling because of the non-compliant. I feel guilty every day that I get into my car in Minneapolis. I took the bus train every day, but that's not available here in Connecticut. Just my thoughts, no remedy. I just do what I can in my daily life. And I think that's something that right now, that's all we can do, with the, what Jane Goodall has said to you, Mitch, everyday decisions that we do, small little things, will have a great impact. And we just have to make sure that we are role models in that and making sure that our family, our neighbors, and our community respond to, these decisions that we make on an everyday, daily basis. And we will see things change for the better. And it is a slow walk. So, but we're walking. We're walking.
Time's running out.
Yeah. We'll get there.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this series. Stay tuned for this summer. I know Dr. Wagener will be coming to do some talks here in person at the Danbury Library. Be sure to check our calendar of events and you can join us. It will be on Tuesday evenings starting in June, I believe. And also be sure to check out the Climate and Human Civilization lecture series at the Midtown campus at WestCon in the Science Building, starting on March 29th. So in a couple of days, there will be another talk with Dr. Brian Stankus. So thanks, everyone.
And those are live?
Those are in person. Yeah.
Yeah, you can, you can wear a mask if you like or not. You can sit in the back if you want. Whatever you want. Whatever you're comfortable.
Tuesday night at the WestCon or the library?
They're Wednesday nights, the next 4 Wednesdays at 7 p.m. in the Science Building. There's a great lecture hall right inside the front door on the ground floor, 125. And if you like, email me and I gave you my email address and I'll send you this flyer. So you don't have to remember it. You can look it up.
And just know that our series, it's going to be called Our Sustainable Future. It's a talk series with Dr. Mitch Wagener, and that's going to start in July. And that's going to be a series of, I believe, 3 talks on sustainable energy, sustainable agriculture, and sustainable land use. So, and that will be discussion ideas presented by Operation Drawdown. And you can register for that in June 5th. And the first talk will be July 18th. So be sure to check our calendar of events here at the Danbury Library for more information once that comes up.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. And
Not everyone.
Good night, everyone. And until
Good
next
night,
time.
everybody. Be green. Bye.